Welcome to a new daily top Askreddit video. Today's topic:
how would you feel if the top tax rate was 90% like it was in the 1950s? Majority of billionaires make their money from capital gains, which in the 50s was at a 25% tax. Today it's 20%. This is really why any change to wage-based income taxes won't really affect wealth inequality. Wealthy people don't make income from wages. It's also why every time the question of funding spending comes up, the automatic discussion is how they should adjust income tax. They want people thinking that it's those pesky doctors and lawyers making $400K a year not paying their fair share, when they absolutely are. The real injustice is that an entire class of people exist who do not need to sell their labor to live, they earn by owning assets. Those are the people not paying their fair share, especially since the gains are earned by the simple act of ownership, not through any effort. I would just love if people understood marginal tax rates at all, but any improvement to the status quo would be welcome. Next, you're going to want people to distinguish income versus capital gains, or even wealth versus income. That's crazy talk. It might require us teaching financial literacy and how to do taxes rather than how to square dance. As an aside, the 91% rate is being used in a misleading way in current incendiary American political discourse, regardless of which side is invoking it or why. The bracket only kicked in above $200,000 in earnings, or roughly $2 million in today's dollars. Fewer than 10,000 households in the entire country hit it, and even then, it only applied to dollars over and above that threshold. After preferential capital gains treatment and deductions, the actual effective federal income tax rate for the top 1% was around 17%. Add state and local and you get to roughly 42% all in. Nothing close to 91%. By 1966 it was so porous that 155 people earning over $200,000 paid literally nothing in federal income tax. This is what embarrassed Congress into debuting the AMT. The more earnest version of the tax the rich like the 50s argument is that effective rates on the ultra-wealthy were maybe 15 to 16 points higher than today, and that would be very meaningful against the tax picture in this country. The interesting counterargument to me is that the high marginal rates may have suppressed extreme wealth accumulation in the first place, essentially keeping people from being remotely as rich as today's rich. Apples to oranges for sure, but that's a different argument than they only kept 10%, which simply isn't true. Edit: when I say misleading, I am simply saying that in current media environments, there is a gigantic lack of understanding wrapped in incendiary or polarizing rhetoric around any statistic that can be bent. Nobody ever actually only kept 9% of their income, and anyone who understands taxes at a basic level understands this. That's how every tax bracket works, but nobody cares to figure out they aren't getting taxed at some rate on all of their income. Just the part over the tax bracket amount. It was a marginal rate, not a confiscatory rate. If you earned $1 million, they didn't take 900,000 of it. Also, if you reinvested or made charitable donations, you wrote that off and it lowered your marginal rate. Almost no one actually had to pay the 90% rate, and there were plenty of people who were filthy rich. I'm pushing 70 years old, so I was alive at the time. So many people commenting here that don't understand this. It's painful to read. It's been so long I don't remember the exact tables and rates, but it went something like, okay, you made 10 million this year, good for you. We will be taxing the last 500,000 because after 9.5 million the marginal rate applies. Remember, in Ike's era, 10 million was a ridiculous amount of money, equal to well over 120 million today. Great, but in today's world, the bigger issue is capital gains and, increasingly, endlessly borrowing against assets. That would involve the wealthy actually selling assets. It is done in certain cases, but in practice, they borrow against those assets as collateral, and the interest that is incurred is actually written off as a loss, reducing their tax burden even further. All the while, their assets continue to increase in value while never actually being taxed for capital gains. Until this loophole is closed off, the wealthiest will continue to amass even greater wealth. Tax the shit out of SBLOCs, margin loans, box spreads, and whatever else on top of capital gains that the top 0.01% use to not pay taxes. While we need more brackets and higher taxes on them, we need a way to hit capital gains. Taxing a guy who owns 10 gas stations at 90% doesn't get at the problem. Having profitable companies pay no taxes due to carryover losses ad infinitum is a problem. It effectively subsidizes their losses. People who make passive income are a problem. There's so much wealth accumulated that it has nowhere to go, and it's inflating the value of assets globally. Stocks, houses, all of the private equity crap, commodities, etc. All of it is dramatically affected by too much wealth concentration. People who make most of their compensation from shares in companies are a problem. When a company rises in value and someone's net worth explodes, none of it is taxed until they sell. They can even borrow against that value and pay no taxes on the borrowed money. It's these things that are creating the black holes in the budgets in governments around the world. Every Western nation is running out of assets to sell off and borrow against, and governments are able to use fewer and fewer tools to not only improve the lives of their citizens but to handle crises. It's going to be a bloodbath when the AI bubble bursts. You can't use carryover losses ad infinitum. That makes no sense. You can use carryover losses until you no longer have losses left to carry over, which is the point at which the company is actually making a taxable profit. I agree. This is the number one thing wrong with America. People think it's a rich versus poor thing. They are close but still wrong. It's an old money versus new money thing. If you're a surgeon or NBA player, you earn a lot of money and pay a lot of taxes. However, if your money comes from generational wealth, you don't. If you earn your money, you pay a high tax rate. If your money earns your money, our tax code benefits you. This should be flipped in the other direction. Earning wealth through stocks and other assets is a way for new money to use the same tricks, but your point stands. Basically, we don't tax the wealthy nearly enough because they take advantage of loopholes that are in place specifically to protect their assets. We need to flip that on its head so that we tax total assets rather than just cash income. Capital gains tax is already a thing. How do you make sure that affects only the problem people and not everyone who owns a house, small business, or any asset being used to try and build any amount of wealth for the average person? Loss carry-forwards are a completely legit deduction. If I lose $100,000 this year and make $100,000 next year, my business has broken even. It's so cute that you think rich people in the 1950s actually paid 90% taxes. Adorable. It was mandatory of either high taxes or reinvest into the workers through healthcare, pension, benefits. That's how the middle class was created. Rich people aren't getting salaried income though. They do a little bit if they're CEO, doctor, etc., but the corporation is responsible for the wages. Those rates were in the 40s and 50s during the 1950s, and most recently cut in TCJA in 2017 down to 21%. There was an onshoring effect because we are now competing with other countries to have the businesses. That's something that didn't have to be factored in the 1950s before globalism. Reducing the taxes doesn't necessarily guarantee increased worker wages, but increasing them can lead to elimination of the positions paying the wages. It was still around 40 to 50 in reality, much higher than now. Of course, we are talking about the USA, for my friends around the globe. For income, sure, but not for cap gains. Most of Rockefeller's money was cap gains, and he was the only person affected by the 90% rate, which only applied to the other income sources. Cap gains was 25% in 1950. They actually did, but it definitely drove different behavior. Bell Labs was a tax avoidance strategy, and it gave us so much tech. Nobody would be dumb enough to pay themselves salaries subject to those tax levels, and that was the idea, so they made their stock more valuable with the money instead. Yes, people paid the marginal rate for income over the relevant threshold. And it created the strongest economy in American history. History shows they actually did. Was just listening to the Culture Study podcast about the history of taxes, and she said compliance was much higher decades ago when taxes were higher, and there was also much less complaining about taxes. How come tax revenue was more or less the same proportionally? Historical records, almost no one paid close to that tax rate due to loopholes. The US still has one of the most progressive tax rates in the OECD. Do we need to simplify the tax system? 100%. We mostly have an insane spending problem. Every administration since Clinton has lowered taxes and increased spending. Yes, some much more than others. To prevent a catastrophic situation regarding our debt, I don't know how we can do it without raising taxes on the middle class and radically cutting government spending. Also reforms to entitlement systems. All political suicide in the current environment. It wasn't even loopholes. I mean, there were loopholes too, but it's really just the rest of the sentence people leave off. That people in the top tax bracket, over $200,000 net income, or more like over $2 million in today's dollars, were taxed approximately 90% on money made over that amount. Not their entire income. So the vast majority of most of their income, even of those richest people, was at a much lower rate, driving their actual net taxes way lower than 90%. In the end, this doesn't bring in as much tax dollars as many allude to. And it doesn't hit them as hard as some allude to. But it very well may have been a good way to limit wealth beyond a certain point, via income at least. It discourages making much past that line in the sand. Though today most of the richest people would be prepared for that, as they've found many ways to increase net worth outside of straight taxed income. If more Americans understood how tax brackets got taxed, I'd think more people would be fine with it. Probably, but it doesn't even matter that much, because the people who aren't paying that 90% plus today also just aren't paying income tax at all. They're taking loans against their assets or holding investments long term and paying capital gains tax instead of income tax. As long as you leave loopholes, you can set the tax rate to 1,000,000% and not a single person will pay that. I'd feel better than I do now. That'd be dumb. Someone making 1 million a year isn't the rich, believe it or not. The mega rich who tend to be the topic of discussion make very little in terms of salary. Jeff Bezos is a prime example. His net worth grows by billions, owns yachts, mansions, sports cars, all on a 80K salary a year. PPL who say we should raise the income tax tend to be the uneducated who do very little research. Someone making $1 million a year is rich. Holy crap, are you delusional?